Welcome to Hearths of Myths. Today, the fire in the hearth flickers with a strange emerald light, and the shadows on the wall begin to shift and dance in ways that defy reason. We are walking the winding, unpredictable, and often misunderstood path of the trickster, the shapeshifter, the father of monsters, Loki. The world was not always as we see it now, defined by the firm boundaries of earth and sky. In the beginning, there was only the yawning void of Ginnungagap, a silent expanse of nothingness that lay between the primordial realms of fire and ice. To the north sat Niflheim, a place of biting frost and endless mist, where the cold grew so heavy it turned into a living thing. To the south glowed Muspelheim, a domain of roaring heat and dancing sparks, where the air itself was a searing breath. It was in this collision of extremes that the universe began its slow awakening, and it is within this same duality that we find the essence of Loki, the most enigmatic figure to ever walk the branches of the world tree, Yggdrasil. To understand Loki, we must first cast our minds into the shadows of the frost-veiled mountains of Jotunheimr, the land of the giants. This is a realm of jagged peaks and ancient secrets, where the wind whispers in tongues forgotten by men and gods alike. It was here, among the elemental powers of the cosmos, that Loki was born, a creature of light and shadow, of spark and decay. Loki's lineage is as mysterious as his character, rooted in the very forces that define the natural world. His father was the giant Farbauti, whose name translates from the Old Norse as the cruel striker or the dangerous hitter. In the ancient skaldic imagination, Farbauti was often associated with lightning, the sudden, violent force that descends from the heavens to shatter the silence of the earth. His mother was Laufey, or sometimes Nal, the leafy island or the needle. Some scholarly interpretations suggest that this union was a metaphorical representation of the birth of wildfire. Imagine, if you will, the cruel striker of lightning hitting the dry leaves or needles of a forest floor. From that violent contact, a spark is born. A spark that consumes, dances, and changes everything it touches. This was Loki. Unlike many of the other Aesir, who were celebrated for their steady strength or unwavering honor, Loki was born of transformation. He was not merely a giant, nor was he ever truly one of the gods. He occupied a liminal space, a flickering flame that refused to be extinguished by the cold winds of the cosmos. As we move deeper into the narrative of his origins, we must look at the names of his brothers, Bileister and Helblindi. While they appear only briefly in the primary texts like the Prose Edda, their presence suggests a family of vast elemental power. Helblindi's name, meaning host blinder, or death blind, hints at a connection to the darker aspects of the unseen world, while Bileister remains a figure of quiet mystery. Loki, however, was the one destined to leave the frozen wastes of his homeland. He was the Lopter, the lofty one, or the one who walks the air. In the earliest days of the world, before the walls of Asgard were high, and before the fates of the gods were sealed, Loki made his way to the gates of the divine realm. He did not arrive as an invader, but as a curiosity. He was slender where the giants were hulking, beautiful where the others were monstrous, and sharp-witted in a way that commanded immediate attention. His physical form was said to be fair and handsome, a stark contrast to the internal chaos he would eventually bring. He possessed eyes that moved like water over stones, always searching, always weighing the weaknesses of those around him. In the halls of the gods, he was a master of the mask. To the Aesir, he was a companion. To the giants, he was a cousin. But to himself, he was a force of pure potentiality. The primary sources, such as the Gylfaginning, describe him as the slanderer of the Aesir and the author of deceits. Yet in those early centuries, his malice was hidden beneath a layer of charm. He was the one who could turn a tense council into a room of laughter with a single clever word. He was the one who could find a path through a mountain when the gods were lost. He was the catalyst. In a world of rigid order, Loki was the necessary friction that kept the wheels of destiny turning. We must reflect on the nature of Jotunheimer to truly grasp the weight of Loki's transition. The giants were the elder kin of the universe, the ones who remembered the world before Odin carved the first man from ash and the first woman from elm. They represented the untamed chaos of the wilderness, the avalanche, the flood, and the storm. By leaving this realm for Asgard, Loki was not just changing his location. He was attempting to bridge the gap between primordial chaos and divine order. This was a dangerous game, for a bridge that connects two opposing shores belongs to neither. Loki lived in the between. He was the shadow cast by the son of the gods, a reminder that even in the brightest halls of Valhalla, the darkness of the beginning was never far away. He learned the secrets of the runes from the shadows and the arts of the dwarves from the deep earth. His name itself, Loki, has been the subject of countless hours of study by those who seek to unlock his true function. Some scholars link it to the Old Norse word luka, meaning to close or to end, suggesting that Loki was always fated to be the one who brings about the conclusion of the age, the knot at the end of the thread. Others see a connection to the word for spider, the weaver of webs who traps the unwary in their own designs. In many ways, both are true. Loki was a weaver of plots, a creator of intricate nets that tangled the gods in their own pride and folly. But he was also the one who brought things to their natural end so that new life could begin. He was the winter that must precede the spring, the fire that clears the old forest to make room for the new. In the quiet moments of the night, when the fires in the hearths of Midgard were low, people whispered of Loki with a mixture of fear and reluctant admiration. They did not build temples to him, nor did they offer him sacrifices in the hope of protection. He was not a god you turned to for safety. Instead, he was the god you hoped would stay away, the one who reminded you that your plans were fragile and your luck was fleeting. He was the uncertainty in the grain harvest, the sudden change in the wind at sea. Yet, without him, the myths would be hollow. Without Loki, Thor would not have his hammer, and Odin would not have his wisdom. He was the thorn in the side of the gods that forced them to grow, to think, and to survive. As we linger on the image of the young Loki standing at the edge of the Bifrost Bridge, gazing up at the shimmering towers of Asgard, we see a figure who is fundamentally alone. He is the son of a giant and a leaf mother, a spark in a cold universe. He does not yet know that he will one day lead the armies of the dead against these very gates. He does not yet know the pain of the venom dripping onto his face, or the loss of his children to the depths of the sea and the roots of the earth. For now, he is simply the trickster, the shapeshifter, the one who can change his face as easily as a man changes his cloak. He steps forward into the light of the Aesir, his heart full of 1,000 schemes, ready to begin the long, winding journey that will eventually lead to the end of all things. The silence of Ginnungagap still echoes in his blood, a reminder that order is but a temporary dream, and that chaos, the chaotic, beautiful, terrible flame of his own spirit, will always have the final word. This is the beginning of the shadow, the first breath of the fire that will one day consume the world. In the high golden halls of Asgard, where the mead flows like a river, and the echoes of warriors' laughter ring against the vaulted ceilings, there exists a bond that defies the laws of nature and the prejudices of the gods. It is a pact sealed in the deepest antiquity, a connection of spirit and essence that bound the king of the gods, Odin All-Father, to the son of giants, Loki. This was not a relationship born of convenience or casual friendship, but a blood brotherhood, an ancient, sacred ritual where two individuals blend their life force together, becoming kin in every sense that matters. To understand the complexity of the Norse pantheon, one must look closely at this shadow bond. In the Poetic Edda, specifically within the stinging verses of the Lokasenna, Loki himself reminds Odin of this forgotten moment. He stands in the center of the hall, amidst the silent glares of the Aesir, and says, "Do you recall it, Odin, when in ancient days we two blended blood together? You said you would not taste ale unless it were brought to us both." This single statement reveals a profound layer of the mythos. In the earliest days of the world's creation, when the structures of power were still fluid, Odin and Loki were more than just companions. They were two halves of a single, restless intellect. Odin, the seeker of wisdom, who would hang from the world tree and pluck out his own eye for a glimpse of the future, found in Loki a kindred spirit, a mind that was not afraid of the dark, a soul that did not shy away from the unconventional. While Odin represented the pursuit of higher truth and sovereign order, Loki represented the pragmatic, often ruthless ingenuity needed to navigate a hostile universe. By mixing their blood, they ensured that the Aesir would always have access to the chaotic energy of the giants, and that Loki would have a permanent seat at the table of the divine. The ritual of blood brotherhood was a solemn affair. In the tradition of the North, it involved cutting the palms of the hands and letting the blood drip into the upturned earth, often under a strip of turf that had been lifted to create a sacred liminal space. The participants would then walk through this earth portal, symbolizing their rebirth as brothers of one another. For Odin and Loki, this meant that their fates were intertwined. From that day forward, the father of the slain and the father of monsters were inseparable in the eyes of the cosmic law. It is why, for many centuries, Odin would not allow a feast to begin in his hall unless Loki was there to share the first draft. He recognized that without the spark of the trickster, the wisdom of the king would be stagnant. They were the wanderers, often traveling through the 9 realms together in disguise, testing the hospitality of men and the strength of devious giants. This bond placed Loki in a unique position within the social hierarchy of Asgard. He was not an adopted son, nor was he a guest. He was a foster brother to the king himself. This afforded him a level of protection that frustrated the other gods. When Thor would reach for his hammer to crush the trickster for some new insolence, it was the memory of this oath that stayed the hand of the Aesir. To strike Loki was to strike a part of Odin. Yet, this brotherhood was also a source of constant tension. Loki was the wolf's sire, a title that alluded to his darker lineage and the monstrous offspring he would eventually produce. The gods knew that by inviting Loki into their circle, they were inviting the very element of their own destruction. They accepted him because he was useful, but they never truly trusted him. And Loki, sensitive to the subtle shifts in the air, knew this better than anyone. In the narrative of their shared travels, we see the dynamic of this brotherhood play out. Odin was the strategist, the one who spoke in riddles and observed the world through the eyes of his ravens, Hugin and Munin. Loki was the executor, the one who moved through the world with a fluid grace, using his shape-shifting abilities to gather information or resolve conflicts that brute force could not touch. There is a sense of mutual respect in these early stories, a recognition that they each possessed a piece of the puzzle that the other lacked. Odin sought the mead of poetry to inspire the world, while Loki sought the means to keep the world interesting. They were two sides of the same coin, the sovereign and the subverter, the one who builds the law and the one who proves its necessity by breaking it. As we explore the atmospheric weight of this oath, we must consider the silence of the other gods. Frigg, the wise queen of Asgard, watched this brotherhood with eyes that saw more than she ever spoke. She knew that the blood of the giants was volatile. Tyr, the god of justice and war, surely saw the inherent contradiction in a king of order binding himself to the prince of chaos, but the oath was absolute. In the Germanic and Norse worldview, an oath was not just a promise. It was a physical weight, a strand in the web of weird that could not be untangled without tearing the whole structure apart. Loki's presence in Asgard was the price Odin paid for his own vast knowledge. To know the secrets of the universe, Odin had to be willing to engage with all its parts, even the ones that bit back. The implications of this brotherhood extended to the very end of time. The bond was so strong that even when Loki's crimes grew too great to ignore, even after the death of the beloved Baldur, the gods struggled with how to punish him. They could not simply kill him, for his blood was Odin's blood. When he was finally bound beneath the earth, it was seen as the ultimate betrayal of this ancient pact, a tearing of the cosmic fabric that signaled the beginning of the end. The Lokasena is the tragic climax of this brotherhood. In that poem, Loki enters the hall of the sea giant Aegir, uninvited and unwanted. He is driven by a bitter resentment, a feeling that the gods have forgotten the ancient days of their shared blood. His insults are not just random slurs, they are a systematic dismantling of the gods' dignity, a reminder of their own hypocrisies. And at the heart of his anger is the broken oath. When we reflect on this relationship in a calm, narrative light, we see that Loki was the other within the self. He was the part of Odin that was allowed to be flawed, the part that was allowed to lie and to steal so that the High One could remain pure in the eyes of his worshippers. Loki was the shadow of the throne. He carried the burdens of the gods' mistakes, often being the one sent to fix the problems that their own arrogance had caused. In return, he was given a home in the clouds, a place among the stars, and the protection of the All-Father. It was a relationship of deep, albeit dark, intimacy. They were the two great travelers of the mythos, the two who understood that the world was not a place of static peace, but a constant struggle of wills. This brotherhood also speaks to the Norse understanding of kinship. In their society, blood was everything, but chosen blood, the blood of the oath, was perhaps even more powerful. It was a testament to the power of the will over the accidents of birth. Loki, the son of the cruel striker, could have been just another giant for Thor to kill. Instead, through this ritual, he became a pillar of the Norse cosmic drama. He was the one who challenged the gods to be better, or at least to be more honest about who they were. The oath of blood was the foundation upon which the entire history of the Aesir was built. It was the bridge that allowed the stories to happen, the necessary connection between the primordial past and the doomed future. As the years turned into centuries and the world aged, the memory of the blood-blending ritual began to fade into the background, replaced by the immediate grievances of the gods. But Loki never forgot. Every time he was mocked, every time he was excluded from the inner circles of the Aesir, he felt the sting of that ancient day in the dirt. He was the brother who was always treated like a servant, the kin who was always viewed as a stranger. This duality, being bound by blood but separated by nature, is what fueled the fire of his eventual rebellion. The oath that had once brought him into the light of Asgard would eventually be the very thing that cast him into the deepest darkness, as the gods realized that some blood, no matter how sacred the ritual, can never truly be tamed. Loki remained the spark, and Odin remained the witness, both of them locked in a brotherhood that would only find its resolution in the flames of Ragnarök, when the blood they had shared would finally be spilled upon the earth one last time. The air in Asgard was once filled not with the sound of feasting, but with the rhythmic, heavy thud of stone hitting stone, and the biting whistle of a wind that carried the scent of a winter that refused to end. In those early days, the home of the gods was a place of fragile beauty, a realm that lacked the formidable defenses necessary to keep the terrors of Jotunheimer at bay. The Aesir, for all their power, felt the encroaching shadows of the giants, and it was this vulnerability that invited a stranger into their midst, a master mason of immense stature and quiet confidence. He arrived on a horse named Svadilfari, a beast that seemed to be carved from the very mountains themselves, with hooves that cracked the frozen earth and muscles that rippled like tectonic plates under a coat as black as a starless night. The mason offered a bargain that would change the history of the 9 realms. He would build a wall so high and so thick that no giant could ever hope to breach it. But the price he demanded was one that sent a shiver through the divine assembly. He wanted the sun from the sky, the moon from the heavens, and the hand of the goddess Freya in marriage. The gods sat in their high seats, their brows furrowed in anger and hesitation. To lose the sun and the moon was to plunge the world into eternal darkness, and to surrender Freya, the very heart of Asgard's beauty and fertility, was unthinkable. Yet, the need for the wall was desperate. It was here that Loki stepped forward from the shadows, his eyes gleaming with the dangerous light of a man who believes he can outsmart destiny itself. He proposed a counter-offer, a trap disguised as a compromise. The mason could have his price, Loki suggested, but only if he completed the entire wall within a single winter. If a single stone was missing by the first day of summer, the bargain would be void, and the mason would receive nothing. Loki reasoned that no mortal or giant could possibly move such massive stones in so little time, even with the help of a horse. The gods, swayed by Loki's silver tongue and their own desire for security, agreed. They swore oaths that were binding and ancient, believing they had secured a fortress for free. But, as the weeks bled into months, the gods watched with growing horror as the wall rose with impossible speed. The horse, Svadilfari, proved to be more than a mere animal. He was a force of nature. Night after night, the stallion hauled blocks of granite that weighed more than a dozen men, moving with a tireless, haunting grace through the snow. The mason worked in silence, his hammer echoing through the valleys, and as the deadline approached, only the gateway remained unfinished. The sun began to feel heavier in the sky, as if it were prepared to be plucked away, and Freya's weeping filled the halls of Sessrumnir. The gods turned their fury toward the one who had convinced them to take the risk. They surrounded Loki, their shadows long and menacing against the half-finished walls, and threatened him with a slow, agonizing death if he did not find a way to halt the mason's progress. They demanded that he sabotage the very work he had encouraged. Loki, facing the cold steel of Thor's gaze and the silent judgment of Odin, knew that his wit was his only shield. He slipped away from the assembly as the sun began to dip toward the horizon on the final night of winter. He did not use fire or blade. Instead, he used the ancient art of the shapeshifter. In the dark woods near the construction site, Loki transformed himself into a magnificent mare, her coat the color of autumn leaves and her scent carrying the irresistible promise of spring. As Svadilfari labored to bring the final stones for the gate, the mare emerged from the trees, neighing a low, haunting melody that cut through the stallion's focus. The black horse, possessed by a sudden, primal longing, snapped his lead ropes and abandoned his master. He galloped into the forest, chasing the shadow of the mare through the thickets and over the frozen streams. The mason, left alone in the cold, realized he had been tricked. His calm facade shattered, revealing the towering, furious form of a rock giant. The gods, seeing the builder's true nature, no longer felt bound by their oaths of hospitality. Thor, whose hammer Mjolnir was always hungry for the blood of giants, stepped forward. One blow was all it took to shatter the mason's skull into 1,000 fragments, sending him back to the dust from which he came. The wall stood nearly complete, a silent testament to the danger of divine bargains. But the story did not end with the giant's death. For months, Loki was absent from Asgard, his whereabouts a mystery to both his brothers and his enemies. When he finally returned, he did not come alone. He led a creature that defied the understanding of the natural world, a gray colt with 8 legs, moving with a speed that seemed to blur the lines between the air and the ground. This was Sleipnir, the child of Loki and Svadilfari. Loki presented the horse to Odin, a gesture of atonement, and perhaps a subtle reminder of the lengths he would go to for the safety of the Aesir. Sleipnir was the greatest of all horses, capable of galloping over the sea and through the air, and even down into the lightless depths of the underworld. To look upon Sleipnir was to see the physical manifestation of Loki's fluid nature. The horse carried the mark of the trickster's sacrifice, the shame of the shapeshift, and the burden of a motherhood that was both a joke and a tragedy. Odin accepted the gift, and Sleipnir became his faithful mount, the 8 legs representing the 4 cardinal directions and the 4 intermediate points, a symbol of the All-Father's total dominion over the 9 realms. The birth of Sleipnir serves as a profound narrative anchor for Loki's character. It highlights the total lack of ego in his survival instincts. He was willing to inhabit any form, endure any biological reality, and suffer any ridicule to resolve the crises he often precipitated. The other gods mocked him for it, their laughter echoing in the mead halls as they told the tale of the mare of Svadilfari. But Loki wore their mockery like a cloak. He understood what they did not, that the world is not won by the strong who stay in their lane, but by the flexible who are willing to lose themselves in the act of transformation. The wall of Asgard stood high, a barrier of stone, but the eight-legged horse was a barrier of a different kind, a reminder that the gods were forever beholden to the chaos they claimed to despise. As we dwell on the silence of the forest where the mare once ran, we feel the weight of Loki's solitude. He was the mother of the king's horse, yet he remained a stranger in the king's house. There are moments in the history of the gods when the sheer restlessness of Loki's spirit led to acts of inexplicable cruelty, acts that seemed to serve no purpose other than to disrupt the peace of the divine. One such evening, as the goddess Sif, the wife of Thor, lay sleeping in her bower, her long, flowing hair spread across her pillows like a river of spun sunlight, Loki crept into her chambers. Sif's hair was her greatest pride, a symbol of the ripened grain of Midgard and the golden fertility of the earth. With a pair of sharp shears and a heart full of chaotic mischief, Loki shorn the goddess's head, leaving her bald and broken. He did not steal the hair for profit, nor did he use it in a spell. He simply threw it away, leaving the beauty of Asgard diminished for the sake of a moment's boredom. When Sif awoke and saw her reflection, her screams brought Thor galloping back from his journeys. The thunder god's rage was a thing of terror. The sky over Asgard turned the color of a bruised plum, and the ground trembled with the force of his footsteps. He knew instinctively who was responsible. He found Loki lurking near the edge of the world and seized him by the throat, lifting him into the air until the trickster's face turned the color of the deep sea. Thor promised to break every bone in Loki's body one by one, until there was nothing left but a pile of shattered vanity. Terrified by the proximity of his own end, Loki pleaded for his life, promising that he would not only replace Sif's hair, but would bring back treasures that would make the gods more powerful than they had ever dreamed. Loki descended into the dark, sweltering heart of the earth, to the realm of Svartalfheim, where the Ivaldi sons, the master smiths of the dwarves, labored in the glow of volcanic fires. The dwarves were beings of ancient craft, their hands capable of shaping the very bones of the world into objects of magic and wonder. Loki, using his talent for manipulation, convinced the sons of Ivaldi to forge 3 great gifts: a head of hair made from real gold that would grow from Sif's scalp as if it were natural, the spear Gungnir, which never missed its mark, and the ship Skidbladnir, which could be folded up like a piece of parchment and tucked into a pocket, yet could carry all the gods of Asgard when unfolded. But Loki, never content with a simple victory, decided to push his luck further. He visited another pair of brothers, Brokkr and Sindri, and wagered his own head that they could not produce 3 items as magnificent as those made by the sons of Ivaldi. The dwarf brothers accepted the challenge, their pride as great as their skill. As Sindri began to work, he placed a pig's skin in the forge and told Brokkr to blow the bellows without ceasing until the work was done. Loki, fearing for his life, transformed into a large, biting fly. He stung Brokkr on the hand, hoping to make him stop, but the dwarf endured the pain. From the forge emerged Gullinbursti, a boar with bristles of gold that could run through air and water faster than any horse, shedding light in the deepest darkness. Next, Sindri placed gold in the forge. Loki, as the fly, stung Brokkr on the neck, drawing blood, But again the dwarf did not falter. From the heat came Draupnir, the heavy arm ring of gold that would drop 8 identical rings of equal weight every 9th night, ensuring eternal wealth for its wearer. Finally, Sindri placed iron in the forge to create the ultimate weapon. This time, Loki bit Brokkr on the eyelid, the blood flowing so freely that the dwarf was forced to reach up for a single second to wipe his eye. Because of this momentary lapse, the handle of the hammer they were forging, Mjolnir, was made slightly too short. Loki returned to Asgard with the 6 treasures, presenting them to the gods in a grand assembly. To Sif he gave the golden hair, and as it touched her head, it took root and began to grow, more beautiful than before. To Odin he gave the spear Gungnir and the ring Draupnir. To Freyr he gave the ship Skidbladnir and the boar Gullinbursti. And finally, to Thor he gave Mjolnir. Loki explained that while the handle was short, the hammer was the greatest weapon in existence. It would never break. It would always return to the hand of the thrower, and it could level mountains with a single strike. The gods were overjoyed, realizing that Mjolnir was the ultimate defense against the frost giants. They ruled that Loki had won the favor of the Aesir, but Brokkr, who had followed Loki to Asgard, demanded the trickster's head. Loki, ever the lawyer, pointed out that while he had wagered his head, he had said nothing about his neck. Brokkr could take the head, but he could not touch even an inch of the neck to get it. Frustrated by the trickster's logic, the gods allowed the dwarf to take a different kind of vengeance. Brokkr took an awl and a leather thong and sewed Loki's lips together, silencing the voice that had caused so much trouble. This physical binding, known as Vartari, was a moment of rare silence for the trickster. He spent weeks with his mouth stitched shut, the pain a constant reminder of the price of his arrogance. Eventually, he tore the threads away, but the scars remained, jagged lines around his mouth that served as a visual testament to his nature as a liar and a thief. This myth illustrates the fundamental paradox of Loki's role in the Norse world. He is the thief who creates, the destroyer who inadvertently provides the tools for survival. Without Loki's malice, Sif would never have had her golden hair, and Thor would never have carried the hammer that protected the world. He is the catalyst for divine evolution. The short handle of Mjolnir, caused by Loki's interference, is perhaps the most symbolic detail of all. It represents the imperfection inherent in even the most powerful things, a reminder that in a world touched by the trickster, nothing is ever completely perfect, and every gift comes with a hidden cost. As the gods feasted that night, their new treasures gleaming in the torchlight, Loki sat in the corner, his lips scarred and his mind already turning toward the next scheme, forever the architect of both the gods' glory and their eventual ruin. The geography of the cosmos is not merely a collection of physical locations. It is a map of the spirit, where the brightest light of Asgard finds its terrifying mirror in the deepest shadows of Jotunheimr. Deep within the eastern reaches of the land of the giants lies a place that even the bravest of the Aesir avoid in their dreams. Jarnvidr, the Iron Wood. In this desolate expanse, the trees do not have leaves of green or silver, but foliage made of cold, jagged iron that clatters in the wind like the blades of 1,000 daggers. The sap that runs through their trunks is not sweet, but a dark, metallic poison. It was here, in the suffocating gloom of the iron wood that Loki sought a different kind of companionship, away from the judgmental eyes of Odin and the thunderous disapproval of Thor. He sought out the giantess Angerboda, whose name translates chillingly to the one who brings sorrow. She was a witch of immense power, a mistress of the old magic that predated the arrival of the gods, and in the silence of those iron groves, Loki and Angerboda conceived 3 children, who would eventually become the architects of the world's destruction. The first of these offspring was a wolf, but not a wolf born of the natural world. Fenrir was his name, and from the moment of his birth, his eyes held a hunger that seemed capable of swallowing the sun. He was a creature of constant growth, a living manifestation of an appetite that knew no boundaries. The second was Jormungandr, a serpent so vast and so cold that the air around him froze into crystalline shards. He was not a creature of the land, but a being of the deep, a coiled weight of scales and venom. The third was Hel, a daughter whose very appearance was a testament to the duality of Loki's nature. One half of her body was that of a beautiful woman, fair and vibrant, while the other half was the blue-gray of rotting flesh, cold and lifeless. She did not cry as an infant. She simply stared with an eye that saw the end of every living thing. Loki kept these children secret for as long as he could, hidden within the depths of the iron wood, perhaps fearing that the gods would see in them the reflection of his own hidden darkness. But in Asgard, the High One, Odin, began to feel a disturbance in the shifting winds of the future. The Volvas, the prophetesses who spoke from the grave and the mist, began to whisper of a new threat rising in the east. They spoke of the wolf's litter, and the doom that would come to the Aesir from the children of the trickster. Odin, possessed by his eternal need to control destiny, ordered the gods to ride into Jotunheimr and seize the children. The journey was long and perilous, led by the god Tyr, who was the only one amongst them who did not feel the prickle of fear at the mention of the iron wood. When they found the children, the gods were struck with a profound sense of horror. They saw not just animals or monsters, but the physical embodiment of the gods' own eventual end. Upon their return to Asgard, the judgment was swift. Jormungandr, the great serpent, was cast by Odin into the deep, churning waters of the oceans that surrounds Midgard. The serpent fell for what seemed like an age, and as he hit the freezing depths, he began to grow, expanding until he encircled the entire world, eventually biting his own tail in a gesture of eternal entrapment. He became the Midgard serpent, the one whose movements caused the tides to turn and the earth to tremble. Hel, the half-dead daughter, was sent to the lowest of the 9 realms, a place of mist and shadow that would eventually bear her name. Odin gave her authority over the dead, those who died not in the glory of battle, but of old age, sickness, and grief. She became the queen of the underworld, building a hall called Eljudnir, where her plate was hunger, and her knife was famine. In the cold silence of her kingdom, she waited, knowing that eventually every soul that did not reach Valhalla would belong to her. But the wolf, Fenrir, presented a different problem. He was small enough at first to be kept in Asgard, and it was only Tyr who had the courage to feed him, bringing him meat while the other gods watched from a distance, their hands resting on their sword hilts. Every day, Fenrir grew larger. His footsteps began to sound like thunder, and his breath smelled of blood and ancient forests. The gods realized that they could not allow him to roam free, for he would eventually consume the very halls of the divine. They decided to bind him, but they knew that if they used force, the wolf would tear them apart. So they approached him as if it were a game, a test of his legendary strength. The first chain they brought was called lading, made of the strongest iron in the world. Fenrir, looking at the heavy links, allowed the gods to bind him. With a single effortless shrug of his shoulders, the iron shattered like glass. The gods, hiding their growing panic, forged a second chain, twice as strong as the first, named Dromi. Again, Fenrir accepted the challenge, wanting to prove his prowess to the Aesir. He waited until the chains were tight. Then he kicked his massive legs and flexed his spine. Dromi burst into 1,000 pieces, flying through the air like lethal shrapnel. The gods realized then that no physical material forged by their hands or the hands of men would ever hold the child of Loki. In desperation, Odin sent a messenger to the deep caverns of Svartalfheim, to the master smiths of the dwarves. He asked them to forge a chain that was not made of substance, but of concepts, a chain that was a paradox. The dwarves, working in the silence of their subterranean forges, gathered 6 secret ingredients: the sound of a cat's footfall, the beard of a woman, the roots of a mountain, the sinews of a bear, the breath of a fish, and the spittle of a bird. These are things that do not exist in the world today, because they were all used to create Gleipnir. When the chain was finished, it did not look like iron. It looked like a ribbon of silken thread, soft to the touch, and as light as a whisper. The gods took Fenrir to the island of Lyngvi, in the middle of Lake Amsvartnir, and showed him the ribbon. The wolf, suspicious of the thin cord, sensed the magic woven into its fibers. He refused to be bound unless one of the gods placed their hand in his mouth as a pledge of good faith, a guarantee that if the ribbon did not break, they would release him. The gods stood frozen, their faces pale. They knew that Gleipnir would never break, and that whoever gave their hand would lose it. It was Tyr, the god of honor and justice, who stepped forward. He looked the wolf in those burning eyes and placed his right hand between those jagged mountain-crushing teeth. The gods bound Fenrir with the silken thread. The wolf struggled. He thrashed and he heaved, his muscles bulging like great serpents under his fur. But the more he fought, the tighter Gleipnir became. It held him fast, pinning him to the earth. When Fenrir realized he had been betrayed, his jaws snapped shut, severing Tyr's hand at the wrist. The gods laughed, their relief turning into cruelty. But Tyr stood in silence, his blood staining the grass, the only one amongst them who understood the gravity of what they had done. They took a sword and jammed it into the wolf's mouth, the hilt in the lower jaw and the point in the upper, so that he could never close his mouth again. Fenrir howled, a sound of pure, unadulterated agony and rage, and the foam that dripped from his mouth formed the river Van. Loki watched all of this from the periphery. He saw his children cast away, imprisoned, and tortured by the very beings who called him brother. The narrative often portrays Loki as a villain for his eventual betrayal of the gods, but here, in the shadow of the iron wood in the cold island of Lyngvi, we see the seeds of his resentment. The Aesir had not just bound a wolf, they had bound Loki's heart. They had taken the products of his love for Angerboda and turned them into symbols of fear. This was the moment the blood-brotherhood truly began to fray. Loki realized that he was only welcome in Asgard as long as he was useful or entertaining. As soon as his nature manifested in a way they could not control, he and his kin were discarded. The binding of Fenrir was a victory for the gods, but it was a hollow one. It ensured that when the end of the world finally came, the wolf would be waiting, his hunger fueled by eons of darkness and the memory of the gods' laughter. The immortality of the Norse gods was not an inherent quality of their divine blood, but a fragile gift that had to be maintained through constant ritual. Unlike the gods of other cultures who were born with eternal youth, the Aesir were subject to the passage of time. They could grow weary, their hair could turn the color of winter frost, and their skin could wither like a fallen leaf. Their only defense against this inevitable decay was a collection of golden apples, kept in a chest of enchanted wood and guarded by the goddess Odin. These apples were the very pulse of Asgard, the source of the gods' vitality, and their ability to stand against the encroaching cold of the cosmos. Idun, the wife of the poet god Bragi, was the only one permitted to touch the fruit, and it was her gentle presence that ensured the sun continued to rise over the golden towers of Valhalla. But Loki, driven by his own survival and his inability to say no to a dangerous bargain, would eventually place this entire divine order in jeopardy. The tragedy began during a journey across the desolate mountains of Midgard. Odin, Loki, and the silent god Fenrir were traveling through a region where the wind was so cold it seemed to bite through their cloaks. They were hungry, having found no game for days, until they came across a herd of oxen grazing in a hidden valley. They slaughtered one of the beasts and built a great fire, hoping to roast the meat and regain their strength. But as the hours passed, the meat remained raw, cold as ice despite the roaring flames beneath it. They tried to build the fire higher, adding more wood and bellows, but the supernatural cold persisted. From the branches of a massive oak tree above them, a voice spoke, a deep, resonant sound that carried the weight of the mountains. Looking up, they saw an eagle of impossible size, its feathers the color of storm clouds, and its eyes like polished obsidian. The eagle told them that it was his magic that was preventing the meat from cooking, and that he would only allow it to roast if they gave him his share of the meal. The gods, desperate for food, agreed. But when the meat was finally done, the eagle descended and seized the best portions, the 2 hindquarters and both shoulders, leaving almost nothing for the 3 travelers. Loki, his temper flaring, grabbed a long pole and struck the eagle with all his might. But as the pole hit the bird's back, Loki found that his hands were stuck to the wood, and the wood was stuck to the eagle. The bird took flight, dragging Loki across the jagged rocks and through the freezing air, his screams echoing through the canyons. The eagle was not a bird at all, but the giant Thiazi in shape-shifted form. He flew higher and higher, threatening to dash Loki against the mountain peaks unless the trickster swore a terrible oath. Thiazi demanded the apples of Idun. Loki, fearing for his life and feeling the cold of the upper atmosphere freezing his lungs, promised that he would lure the goddess out of the safety of Asgard and into the giant's grasp. When he was finally released, he returned to Odin and Fenrir, his face pale and his mind already weaving the web of his betrayal. He told them nothing of the bargain, but his eyes were restless, avoiding the steady gaze of the All-Father. Back in Asgard, Loki waited for the perfect moment. He approached Idun in her garden, his voice soft and persuasive. like the rustle of leaves in the evening. He told her that he had found a forest in the world below where trees grew that produced apples even more magnificent than her own. He suggested that she should come with him to see them, and that she should bring her own apples to compare the two. Idun, being innocent and unsuspecting of the darkness that lived in her husband's foster brother, followed him through the gates of Asgard and across the Bifrost Bridge. As soon as they stepped into the shadow of the great forest, the eagle Thiazi descended from the sky. He seized the goddess and her precious chest in his talons and vanished into the northern mists, heading toward his mountain fortress of Thrymheimer. The effect on Asgard was immediate and catastrophic. Without the apples, the gods began to age. The golden hair of Sif turned gray. The strength of Thor began to falter. The wisdom of Odin became clouded by the fog of senility. The halls of the gods, once filled with light and song, became quiet and dim, as the deities realized they were becoming mortal. They gathered in council, their hands trembling and their voices thin. They looked at one another, searching for the cause of their decline, until they remembered that Loki was the last person seen with Idun. They seized him, their old anger rekindled by the fear of their own death, and threatened him with every torment imaginable if he did not bring the goddess back. Loki, realizing that he was once again the architect of his own misery, asked for the falcon cloak of the goddess Freya. He transformed into a hawk and flew toward the north, toward the icy peaks of Thrymheimer. He found the fortress at a moment when Thiazi had gone out to sea to fish, leaving Idun alone in the cold stone hall. Loki did not hesitate. He used his magic to transform the goddess into a single nut, which he clutched in his talons and took flight back toward the south. But as he crossed the mountains, he heard the thunderous beating of wings behind him. Thiazi had returned, discovered the theft, and assumed his eagle form once again. The chase was a desperate struggle between the hawk and the eagle, between the spark of life and the shadow of death. As they approached the walls of Asgard, the gods watched from the ramparts, their hearts beating with a faint, flickering hope. They saw the hawk straining every muscle, the eagle gaining on him with every stroke of his massive wings. The Aesir gathered bundles of wood and shavings, piling them high along the walls. Just as Loki cleared the ramparts and dived into the safety of the city, the gods set the wood on fire. A wall of flame roared into the sky. Loki, being a master of fire, flew through the heat unharmed, but the eagle Thiazi could not stop his momentum. His feathers caught fire, and he fell to the ground inside the city, where the gods, their strength momentarily returned by the proximity of the apples, fell upon him and slew him. Idun was restored to her form, and the gods feasted upon the apples once more, their youth and vitality returning like the sun after a long winter. But the death of Thiazi brought a new shadow. His daughter, the giantess Skadi, arrived at the gates of Asgard, clad in armor and carrying a spear, demanding Wergild, payment for the life of her father. The gods, wanting to avoid further conflict, offered her a choice of a husband from among them, and the gift of laughter, which she had lost in her grief. Loki, once again tasked with fixing the problems he had caused, performed a series of grotesque and absurd antics to make the giantess laugh, eventually succeeding by tying his own anatomy to a goat in a display of ribald desperation. This story of the apples of Idun is more than a simple adventure. It is a meditation on the cost of life and the necessity of the trickster. Loki is the one who brings the gods to the edge of the grave, only to pull them back at the last second. He is the reminder that divinity is not a permanent state, but a constant struggle against the forces of entropy and chaos. The giant Thiazi, whose eyes were eventually placed in the sky as stars by Odin, represents the ancient, cold power of the world that seeks to reclaim the warmth of the gods. And Loki, the hawk caught between the flame and the eagle, remains the essential catalyst. He is the one who understands that to truly appreciate the golden apples of immortality, one must first feel the cold breath of the eagle on their neck and the gray frost of age in their hair. The journey into the frozen, jagged heart of Jotunheimer was never meant to be a simple expedition of conquest. It was a descent into the very limits of divine understanding, a road that led Thor and Loki to the edge of the world, where the logic of Asgard began to unravel like a frayed rope. The thunder god, ever restless and hungry for the glory of shattering giant skulls, had decided to seek out the fabled fortress of Utgardar, the Outcourts, a place whispered about in the high halls of the Aesir as a domain of ancient, untouchable magic. Loki, ever the willing companion to trouble, agreed to accompany him, his mind already spinning with the possibilities of what might be discovered in the shadows of the north. They departed Asgard in Thor's heavy iron chariot, drawn by the two legendary goats, Tangrisnir and Tangnjoster, the teeth grinder and the teeth gnasher. The sound of the chariot's wheels was the sound of summer storms breaking over the mountains, but as they crossed the Bifrost and descended toward the realm of men, the atmosphere shifted, growing heavy with the scent of pine needles and damp earth. As night began to fall over Midgard, casting long, purple shadows across the farmsteads of mortals, the two gods sought shelter at the home of a humble peasant family. The farmhouse was a sturdy building of timber and sod, smelling of wood smoke and the honest sweat of those who worked the land. The family, a man, his wife, and their two children, Thialfi and Röskva, were struck with a paralyzing awe at the arrival of the divine travelers. Thor, seeing their poverty and knowing that their meager stores would never satisfy his hunger, performed a miracle of terrifying intimacy. He slaughtered his two goats, skinning them and placing their meat into a great iron cauldron to boil. He invited the family to feast with him and Loki, offering them the divine flesh of his own steeds, but he issued a singular, stern command. No one was to break a single bone. All the remains were to be thrown onto the goatskins, which he had spread carefully beside the hearth. The feast began in a silence broken only by the crackle of the fire and the sound of the wind outside. Loki, however, sat in the shadows, his eyes flickering toward the young boy, Thialfi. Whether driven by a desire to test the gods or simply by the inherent chaos of his nature, Loki whispered to the boy, suggesting that the marrow within the bones was the most delicious part of the meat, a treasure that should not be wasted. Thialfi, overcome by the hunger of a growing child and the subtle persuasion of the trickster, took a knife and cracked one of the goat's thigh bones, sucking out the richness hidden within, before tossing the splintered remains back onto the pile. Loki watched, a ghost of a smile touching his scarred lips as the boy returned to his seat. In the gray light of dawn, Thor rose and took his hammer, Mjolnir. He held the weapon over the skins and the bones, and with a flash of divine energy, the goats were restored to life. They stood up, shaking their heads as if awakening from a long sleep. But as Tangnjoster attempted to take a step, he stumbled, his hind leg dragging uselessly in the dirt. Thor's face transformed instantly into a mask of thunderous rage. He gripped the handle of his hammer until his knuckles turned as white as the snows of Niflheim, and his eyes burned with a fire that seemed to scorch the very air of the farmhouse. The family fell to their knees, begging for mercy, offering everything they owned to stay the god's hand. Thor, looking down at the terrified faces of the children, felt his anger soften into a cold, stern justice. He decided to spare their lives, but in exchange, he took Thjalfi and Röskva as his lifelong servants. They were to leave their home and follow the gods into the wild unknown, their lives now entwined with the fate of Asgard. Leaving the chariot and the goats behind at the farmstead, the 4 travelers, Thor, Loki, and the 2 children, began their journey toward the east, toward the great sea and the mountains of Jotunheimer. The landscape grew increasingly desolate. The trees were twisted and ancient, their branches interlocking like the fingers of a skeleton, and the ground was covered in a deep, perpetual mist that made every step a gamble. They crossed the ocean in a boat that seemed too small for the weight of Thor's presence, arriving on the shores of a land where the rocks were the size of houses, and the silence was so absolute it felt like a physical weight on their chests. They walked for days through a forest of massive oaks, the air growing colder with every mile, until the sun dipped below the horizon and the darkness of the giant's realm enveloped them. Desperate for shelter, they stumbled upon a building of strange and unsettling proportions. It was a vast, hollow structure, with a wide opening on one end, and 5 smaller chambers branching off to the side. There was no hearth, no furniture, and no sign of life, yet the air within was still and strangely warm. They settled into one of the smaller chambers, but their sleep was interrupted in the middle of the night by a sound that shook the very foundations of the earth. It was a rhythmic, roaring vibration that sounded like a mountain collapsing over and over again. Thor stood at the entrance of their chamber, hammer in hand, his heart pounding with the thrill of a looming battle, while the others huddled in the darkness, trembling at the sheer scale of the sound. When the first light of morning filtered through the trees, Thor stepped outside to investigate the source of the noise. What he found was not a mountain, but a giant, lying in the forest nearby. The building they had slept in was not a hall at all. It was the giant's glove, and the chamber where they had hidden was the thumb. The giant, whose name was Skrymir, or the Big Fellow, sat up and looked down at the tiny figures of the gods with an expression of mild curiosity. He did not seem threatened by Thor's hammer. In fact, he spoke with a booming, jovial tone that seemed to vibrate in the very bones of the travelers. Skrymir suggested that they travel together, and he offered to carry all their provisions in his own massive leather bag, tying it tight with a knot that seemed simple enough. All day they walked, the giant taking strides that covered miles in a single step, while Thor and his companions struggled to keep pace through the undergrowth. When evening came, Skrymir lay down under a massive oak tree and fell instantly into a deep sleep, his snoring once again shaking the forest. He told Thor to go ahead and open the bag to prepare their supper, but as Thor and Loki tugged at the leather thongs, they found that the knot was impossible to untie. It was as if the leather had turned to iron. No matter how much they pulled or strained, the bag remained sealed. Thor, his hunger turning into a white-hot fury, decided that he had had enough of the giant's company. He gripped Mjolnir and struck Skrymir square in the middle of the forehead with a blow that should have leveled a city. The giant merely blinked and reached up to his head, asking if a leaf had fallen on him. He fell back asleep, snoring louder than before. Thor, stunned and humiliated, waited until the middle of the night and struck again, this time aiming for the giant's temple with even greater force. Skrymir stirred and asked if an acorn had dropped from the tree. Finally, just before dawn, Thor delivered a third blow, his face twisted with the effort of putting every ounce of his divine power into the strike. The hammer seemed to sink deep into the giant's skull. Skrymir woke up and asked if some bird droppings had fallen on his face, suggesting that they must be nearing the fortress of Utgardar. He pointed the way toward the north and took his leave, disappearing into the woods with a laugh that echoed long after he was gone. Loki watched the giant disappear, his mind racing. He saw the doubt in Thor's eyes, a rare and flickering thing. They had reached the heart of the giant's territory, a place where the physical laws they understood seemed to have no power. They continued their journey, and by midday they saw a fortress of such staggering height that they had to tilt their heads back until their spines cracked to see the top of the walls. The gates were made of iron bars so thick that a man could not reach around them, and the castle itself seemed to be carved from the very ice of the primordial world. They slipped through the bars and entered the great hall, where giants the size of mountains sat on benches of stone, their eyes like cold stars watching the tiny interlopers. This was the hall of Utgarda Loki, the king of the outcourts, and it was here that Loki would have to use every ounce of his cunning just to survive the night. The road they had traveled had brought them to a place of shadows and illusions, where the trickster would finally meet his match in a game played with the very fabric of reality itself. The interior of the fortress of Utgardar was a place where the air itself seemed to vibrate with a discordant, haunting frequency, as if the stones were whispering secrets that the human ear was never meant to comprehend. As Thor, Loki, and their two servants walked down the center of the hall, the giants on the benches did not stand or roar in challenge. They simply looked down with a slow, heavy indifference that was far more unnerving than any threat of violence. At the far end of the hall, seated on a throne of ice and iron, was Utgarda Loki, the king of this desolate domain. He did not rise to greet them. Instead, he let out a short, cold laugh that sounded like the cracking of a glacier. He mocked the small stature of his guests, calling Thor a little boy, and questioning if the stories of the Aesir's power were merely the exaggerations of poets. He stated that in his hall, no one was permitted to stay unless they could prove themselves superior in some craft or feat. Loki, sensing the tension in Thor's muscles and the growing peril of their situation, stepped forward first. He knew that the giants expected strength, but he would offer them the one thing he possessed in abundance: appetite. "I have a feat," Loki said, his voice echoing in the vast, cold space. "I can eat faster than anyone in this hall. My hunger is a flame that consumes all it touches." The giant king smiled, a thin and predatory expression. He called for a man named Loki to come forward, and a long wooden trough filled with cooked meat was placed on the floor between them. Loki sat at one end, and Loki sat at the other. At the signal, they began to eat, their hands moving with a desperate, frantic speed. Loki was a master of the feast. He stripped the meat from the bones with surgical precision, leaving nothing behind but clean white shards. He reached the middle of the trough in a matter of minutes, certain of his victory. But as he looked across at his opponent, his heart sank. Loki had not only eaten the meat, he had consumed the bones, the fat, and even the wooden trough itself. The space where Loki had been was now nothing but scorched earth and empty air. The giants let out a roar of laughter, and Utgarda-Loki ruled that the trickster had been soundly defeated. Loki retreated into the shadows, his mind reeling. He knew his own hunger. It was the hunger of the spark, the drive of the scavenger. But Loki's hunger was something different, something elemental and absolute. Next, the young boy Thialfi offered to race against anyone the king chose. He was the fastest of all mortals, his feet barely touching the ground when he ran. The king led them outside to a level track and called for a small, slender figure named Hugi to compete with the boy. They ran 3 times. In the first race, Hugi reached the finish line and turned back to meet Thialfi before the boy was even halfway through. In the second, Hugi was so far ahead that he seemed to be a mere speck on the horizon. In the third, Thialfi ran until his lungs felt like they were filled with broken glass. But Hugi reached the end before the boy had even begun his stride. Again, the gods were humbled. Then it was Thor's turn. Humiliated by the failures of his companions, demanded a drinking contest. A massive horn was brought into the hall, and Utgarda-Loki explained that it was considered a great feat to empty the horn in a single draught, though most men could do it in 2, and even the weakest could finish it in 3. Thor took the horn, his eyes fixed on the rim. He took a breath that could have sucked the clouds from the sky and drank with a ferocity that made the giants go silent. But when he pulled the horn away, the level of the liquid had barely moved. He tried a second time, drinking until his head throbbed and his vision blurred, but still the horn remained nearly full. A third time he tried, but he could only lower the surface by a few inches. He handed the horn back, his pride shattered. The king then suggested a simple task, one that the children of the giants played to pass the time, lifting his pet cat from the floor. A large gray cat emerged from under the throne, stretching its long limbs. Thor stepped forward, confident that he could lift the beast with one hand. But as he gripped the cat's belly and pulled, the animal's back arched higher and higher. It seemed to stretch toward the ceiling, its weight growing until Thor was straining with every muscle in his body. Despite his legendary strength, he could only manage to lift a single one of the cat's paws off the ground. Finally, Thor, now shaking with a mixture of rage and despair, challenged anyone in the hall to a wrestling match. Utgarda-Loki shook his head and said that his warriors would find it demeaning to wrestle such a small man. Instead, he called for his old nurse, a withered woman named Ellie. Thor looked at the frail, white-haired crone and felt a moment of hesitation, but as they locked arms, he realized his mistake. The harder he pushed, the firmer she stood. She was like the roots of the world, immovable and ancient. Slowly, inexorably, she forced Thor down until he was brought to one knee. The contest was over. The gods were defeated in every trial, and they spent the night in the hall of the giants, their hearts heavy with the weight of their own inadequacy. In the morning, as the travelers prepared to leave, Utgarda-Loki accompanied them to the gates of the fortress. As they reached the open ground, the giant king's expression changed. The cold mockery was gone, replaced by a look of profound respect and a touch of fear. He confessed to them that everything they had experienced was an elaborate web of illusions. He revealed that he was the giant Skrimir they had met in the woods, and that he had used magic to deceive their senses from the very beginning. The 3 blows Thor had struck with his hammer had not hit the giant's head. They had struck a mountain that Skrimir had placed in his path using a glamour, creating 3 vast, square valleys in the landscape that would remain for eternity. He then explained the truth of the contests. Loki had lost the eating match because his opponent, Loki, was not a man, but wildfire itself. It consumes the meat and the wood with equal ease. Thialfi had lost the race because Hugi was not a runner, but the king's own thought, and no one, no matter how fast, can outrun the speed of the mind. As for Thor's trials, the truth was even more staggering. The drinking horn had been connected to the very ocean that surrounds the world. Thor had drunk so much that he had lowered the sea level, creating the very first tides. The cat he had tried to lift was not an animal, but Jormungandr, the Midgard serpent that encircles the earth. When Thor had lifted its paw, the giants had trembled, for he had moved the very foundation of the world. And the old woman, Ellie, was old age itself. There is no one in the 9 realms, neither man nor god, whom old age will not eventually bring to their knees. You have performed feats that should have been impossible, the giant king said, his voice solemn. If I had known your true strength, I would never have let you enter my hall. We must never meet again, for I will always use my magic to keep you from my gates. Thor, hearing this, was seized by a final surge of fury at the trickery. He reached for Mjolnir, intent on leveling the fortress and the king who had dared to deceive him. But as he turned to strike, the fortress was gone. The king was gone. There was only a vast, empty plain, and the sound of the wind whistling through the dry grass. Loki stood in the center of the emptiness. A strange silence settled over him. He had seen the limits of his own hunger and the power of an illusion that could fool even the gods. This journey to the outcourts was a turning point. It showed Loki that there was a magic in the world that was older and more subtle than the strength of the Aesir. It was a lesson in the power of the mind and the fragility of perception. As they began the long walk back toward Asgard, Loki looked at Thor, who was still fuming in silence, and he felt a growing realization. The world was not what it seemed, and the truth was often just a mask worn by a deeper, more terrifying reality. He was the trickster, yes, but he had lived in a hall of whispers where he was merely a child. This experience did not humble Loki. It sharpened him. It taught him that if the world was a lie, then he must become the master of the lie. The seeds of his ultimate betrayal were watered in the empty plains of the north, where he realized that even the gods were just actors in a play they did not fully understand. In the golden age of Asgard, there was a light that seemed to emanate not from the sun, but from the very presence of one being, Baldur the Good. He was the second son of Odin and Frigg, a god so beautiful, so eloquent, and so wise that he was beloved by every creature that drew breath. It was said that the white flowers of the earth, the Leucanthemum vulgare, were named Baldur's brow, because they shared his startling purity. Where Baldur walked, the darkness retreated. Where he spoke, the fiercest arguments turned into songs of peace. He was the promise of a future without strife, the living embodiment of the gods' own hope for eternity. But in the shadow of this perfection, a bitterness began to take root in the heart of Loki. For centuries, Loki had been the one the gods turned to when they needed a laugh or a clever solution. But he was always the outsider, the son of a giant tolerated for his utility. As the gods increasingly gathered around the radiance of Baldur, Loki felt the cold sting of his own irrelevance. He saw in Baldur a goodness he could never possess, and a love he could never earn. This jealousy, silent and invisible at first, began to fester, until it turned into a poison that would eventually dissolve the very foundations of the world. The tragedy began with a dream. Baldur, whose sleep had always been peaceful and filled with visions of light, began to experience nightmares that were dark and heavy with the scent of the grave. He saw his own shadow being stretched across the land of the dead, and he felt a cold wind that no fire in Asgard could warm. When he shared these visions with the other Aesir, a profound silence fell over the halls of Valhalla. Odin, sensing the proximity of fate, mounted his 8-legged horse Sleipnir and rode down into the lightless depths of Niflheim to consult a long-dead seeress. He learned that the halls of Hel were already being prepared for a grand guest, and that the Shining One was indeed destined to leave the world of the living. Distraught, the All-Father returned to Asgard, but it was Frigg, the mother of Baldur, who took the most desperate action to save her son. Frigg traversed the 9 realms, traveling from the highest peaks of Jotunheimer to the deepest caverns of Svartalfheim. She spoke to the fire, the water, the iron, and the stone. She spoke to every tree in every forest, every bird in the sky, every beast in the field, and every disease that withered the flesh. She extracted a sacred oath from all of them. They must never harm Baldur. The elements and the living things of the world agreed, for they all loved the god of light as much as his mother did. When Frigg returned to Asgard, the gods felt a surge of triumph. They believed they had cheated destiny. They turned their fear into a game, gathering on the plain of Idavolar to test Baldur's invulnerability. They threw spears at him, and the spears turned to feathers in mid-air. They struck him with heavy axes, and the blades refused to bite. They shot arrows that bounced off his chest like rain off a window pane. It was a celebration of divine permanence, a carnival of the impossible, and the laughter of the gods echoed across the cosmos. Loki watched this display from a distance, his mind churning with a dark curiosity. He could not accept that anything in the universe was truly beyond the reach of destruction. He knew that even the strongest oath had a shadow, a hidden corner where the light of promise did not reach. Using his shape-shifting arts, Loki transformed himself into a withered old woman and made his way to Fenrir, the mist-shrouded hall of Frigg. He found the goddess spinning gold thread on her wheel, her face serene with the knowledge that her son was safe. Loki, in his disguise, spoke with a voice like dry leaves, praising the miracle of Baldur's safety, but asking if there was truly nothing in the world that had refused to take the oath. Frigg, perhaps blinded by her own relief or the simple need to share the weight of her secret, confessed that there was one small thing she had overlooked. To the west of Asgard, she said, there grew a tiny, fragile plant called the mistletoe. It was so young, so slender, and so insignificant that she had deemed it unnecessary to ask for its oath. She believed it lacked the strength to ever pose a threat to a god. The old woman nodded and slipped away, and as soon as she was out of sight, the mask of the grandmother vanished, replaced by the sharp, predatory features of the trickster. Loki traveled to the western gates and found the plant, a pale, parasitic growth clinging to the branch of an oak tree. He did not see a plant. He saw a weapon. He used his magic to harden the mistletoe, shaping it into a long, slender dart that hummed with a quiet, lethal energy. He returned to the plain of Idavor, where the gods were still engaged in their sport. Among them stood Hodur, Baldur's brother, the blind god who stood on the periphery of the joy, unable to see the target and unable to join in the laughter. Loki approached him, his voice smooth and dripping with a false kindness. He asked why Hodur was not honoring his brother like the others. When Hodur explained that he had no weapon and could not see where to aim, Loki placed the mistletoe dart in his hand. He promised to guide the blind god's arm, telling him that it was only right that he, too, should pay tribute to Baldur's immortality. The scene was one of terrible, suspended beauty. The sun was dipping low, casting long, golden shadows across the grass. The gods were cheering, their faces flushed with mead and triumph. Loki stood behind Hodur, his hands steadying the blind god's grip. He felt the coldness of the dart and the warmth of his own anticipation. "Throw it now," Loki whispered, his voice a ghost of a sound. Hodur threw the dart with all his strength, guided by the unseen hand of the trickster. The mistletoe flew true. It did not turn to a feather. It did not bounce off Baldur's skin. It pierced through his heart as easily as a needle through silk. The silence that followed was absolute. It was not the silence of peace, but the silence of a world that had just stopped breathing. Baldur fell to the earth, his golden hair staining red with his own blood, his eyes fixed on the sky he would never see again. The laughter of the Aesir died in their throats, replaced by a horror that was so deep it felt like the very earth was cracking beneath them. They looked at one another, their hands trembling, but they could not take vengeance in that moment, for they stood on holy ground where blood could not be shed in anger. They were trapped in their own sanctuary, surrounded by the corpse of their own hope. Loki slipped away in the confusion, but he did not feel the triumph he had expected. He had killed the light, yes, but he had also killed the only thing that kept the gods from seeing him for what he truly was. In the darkness of his hiding place, he realized that the game was over. The blood-brotherhood with Odin, the playful mischief of the past, the tolerance of the Aesir. It was all gone, dissolved by the single stroke of the mistletoe. He had proven that the gods were vulnerable, but in doing so, he had invited a darkness that would eventually consume him as well. The death of Baldur was the first crack in the world vessel, the first sign that the winter was coming, not just a winter of snow, but the Fimbul winter of the soul. As the mourning of the gods began, a sound that would eventually fill every corner of the 9 realms, Loki remained in the shadows, a prisoner of his own genius, the architect of a tragedy that even he could not undo. The air in Asgard, following the fall of Baldur, was no longer filled with the scent of pine and mead, but with the heavy, stifling atmosphere of a tomb. The gods moved through their halls like ghosts, their voices reduced to whispers, as if they feared that a loud sound might shatter the fragile remnants of their reality. The sun itself seemed to lose its warmth, and the stars hung in the sky like cold, distant tears. It was Frigg, her heart broken, but her spirit still fighting against the inevitable, who asked if there was anyone among the Aesir who was brave enough to ride into the land of the dead to offer Hel a ransom for the soul of her son. The journey was one of unimaginable peril, for it required traveling into a realm where the laws of life did not apply, and where the shadows could swallow a mind whole. It was Hermodr the Bold, another son of Odin, who stepped forward. He mounted Sleipnir, the 8-legged horse that Loki had once birthed in a moment of desperate shape-shifting, and galloped toward the north, leaving the light of Asgard behind. Hermodr rode for 9 nights through valleys so deep and so dark that he could not see his own hands on the reins. The silence was absolute, a heavy, velvet weight that seemed to press against his lungs. He reached the river Gjöll, the boundary between the living and the dead, where the water was made of cold daggers, and the sound was like the grinding of ancient stones. He crossed the bridge, Gjallarbrú, which was paved with glittering gold. At the gates, he was met by the maiden Modgudr, who guarded the crossing. She looked at the horse and the rider with eyes that had seen 1,000 generations pass into the shadow. She asked why he rode with such life and vigor, for the bridge usually shook under the weight of 5 companies of dead men, yet it shook more under his single horse. When Hermodr explained his mission, she pointed the way further down and to the north, toward the iron gates of the kingdom of Hel. Upon reaching the gates, Hermodr did not wait for them to open. He spurred Sleipnir, and the legendary horse leaped over the high, jagged walls in a single bound, landing in the cold, misty courtyard of the dead. Hermodr entered the great hall of Eljudnir, and there, sitting in the seat of honor, he found his brother Baldur. But this was not the shining god of Asgard. Baldur sat pale and quiet, surrounded by the shadows of those who had died of old age and sickness. Beside him sat his wife, Nanna, who had died of a broken heart during the funeral pyre and had followed her husband into the darkness. Hermodr spent the night with them, a living man in the house of the dead, feeling the warmth of his own blood as a strange and heavy burden. In the morning, Hermodr approached Hel, the queen of this domain. Her face, half vibrant and half decayed, showed no emotion as he pleaded for Baldur's return. He spoke of the universal grief of the Aesir and the emptiness of the world without its light. Hel listened with a cold, calculating patience. She told Hermodr that she would test if Baldur was truly as beloved as the gods claimed. Her condition was simple, but terrifyingly vast. If everything in the world, both living and dead, would weep for Baldur, she would allow him to return to Asgard. But if even one thing refused to shed a tear, if one thing spoke against him or remained silent, he would stay in her kingdom until the end of time. Hermodr returned to Asgard with the news, and the gods felt a flicker of hope. They sent messengers across all the 9 realms, carrying the command that the world should weep for the fallen god. The response was a miracle of sorrow. The humans in Midgard wept until their eyes were red. The animals in the forest howled and cried. The giants in their mountains let out roars of grief. Even the inanimate objects joined the mourning. The stones of the earth grew damp with moisture. The iron in the mountains sweated with cold tears. The very trees wept sap that smelled of sorrow. It seemed as though the entire universe was a single, collective sob, a grand symphony of loss that resonated from the roots of Yggdrasil to the highest branches. The messengers returned toward Asgard, certain that they had achieved the impossible. But as they neared the gates of the divine city, they came across a dark, damp cave where a giantess named Thok sat in the shadows. Her name meant thanks, but her heart was as hard as the granite walls of her home. The messengers asked her to weep for Baldur, so that he might return from the dead. The giantess looked at them with eyes that held the coldness of a winter that never ends. She spoke with a voice that was like the grating of bone on stone. Thok will weep with dry tears for Baldur's funeral pile. Neither in life nor in death had I joy of the king's son. Let hell keep what she has. With those words, the hope of the gods was shattered. The condition had not been met. Baldur would remain in the underworld, and the light would stay buried beneath the earth. The messengers returned to Asgard in a silence that was heavier than any they had known before. But as the gods mourned, a suspicion began to grow in the mind of Odin. He thought of the giantess in the cave, her cold indifference and her sharp, cutting words. He realized that Thok was not a giantess at all. It was Loki. The trickster had transformed himself once again, hiding in the dark to ensure that his work remained complete. He had not only killed Baldur, he had ensured that the god could never be resurrected. He had stolen the possibility of a second chance. This final refusal by Loki, disguised as Thok, represents the total transformation of his character. He was no longer playing a game of wit. He was actively working to ensure the permanence of death. By refusing to weep, he had declared war on the very concept of hope. He had chosen the side of the shadow, aligning himself with the cold, entropic forces of the giants that sought to bring the universe back to the silence of the beginning. The gods, realizing the depth of his betrayal, finally cast aside their oaths of brotherhood. The memory of the blood blending was gone, replaced by a cold, righteous fury. The narrative of Hermodur's journey and the failed resurrection serves as a profound meditation on the finality of loss and the power of a single act of defiance. Loki understood that the world was built on a fragile consensus of belief and emotion. By standing outside that consensus, by being the one who refused to cry when the rest of the universe was drowning in tears, he had asserted his own terrible agency. He had proven that one individual, driven by enough malice and intelligence, could thwart the will of all the gods and the desires of the entire natural world. As we reflect on the image of the dry-eyed giantess sitting in the cave while the world wept, we see the true face of the shadow. Loki was the no in a universe of yes, the silence in the middle of the song. And as he fled from the cave, knowing that the Aesir were finally hunting him with murderous intent, he did not run with fear, but with the cold satisfaction of a man who had finally made his mark on eternity. The light was gone, the gates of hell were closed, and the path to Ragnarök was now laid bare, paved with the dry tears of the trickster. The ocean was a cauldron of frothing white madness, a reflection of the turmoil that had seized the hearts of the Aesir. Following the funeral of Baldur, a hollow silence had descended upon Asgard, but the gears of fate were turning toward a final confrontation. The sea giant Aegir, a being as ancient as the tides and as deep as the abyssal plains, had invited the gods to a grand feast in his undersea hall. This was a place where the pillars were made of coral, and the ceiling glittered with the phosphorescence of countless bioluminescent creatures. Gold was used not as currency, but as light, casting a warm, amber glow over the tables of carved stone. The gods gathered there, seeking to drown their sorrow in Aegir's legendary ale, but the absence of Baldur was like a physical coldness in the room. Loki, the pariah, the murderer of light, was not invited. He was the shadow that the gods tried to forget, the stain they wished to scrub from their memory. But Loki was not a creature of silence. He arrived at the gates of the hall, his eyes burning with a mixture of resentment and a terrible, clarifying clarity. He did not come to ask for forgiveness. He came to strip the gods of their masks. The Lokasenna, or the Flighting of Loki, remains one of the most intellectually jarring and atmospheric texts in the Poetic Edda. It is a narrative of verbal combat, where words are used as daggers to find the soft, unprotected parts of the divine ego. Loki entered the hall, and the air immediately grew tense, the sound of laughter dying like a flame in a vacuum. He began by reminding Odin of their ancient blood-brotherhood, a bond that the All-Father could not ignore without violating his own sacred laws. Forced to allow Loki a seat and a drink, the gods sat in a precarious, vibrating silence. But Loki did not sit for long. He stood in the center of the choral hall and began a systematic dismantling of the Aesir's dignity. He accused Bragi, the god of poetry, of being a coward who feared the very battles he sang about. He mocked Idun for her desperate need for youth, and he insulted Gefjun for her hidden lusts. As the mead flowed, Loki's tongue became a whip of fire. He turned his attention to Odin, the king of the gods, accusing him of unfairness in war, of granting victory to the cowardly and death to the brave. He whispered of Odin's unmanly practices of cedar magic, a taboo for a sovereign, and he threw the All-Father's own inconsistencies back into his face. To Frigg, he boasted of his role in Baldur's death, a cruel and unnecessary admission that tore through the queen's remaining composure. He accused Freya of unbridled promiscuity and mocked Njordr for his origins as a hostage of the Vanir War. Even the steadfast Tyr was not spared. Loki reminded him of his lost hand and the wolf that had taken it, Loki's own son. Heimdall, the ever-vigilant guardian, was ridiculed as a man with a muddy back, a reference to his eternal and tiresome duty. This was not merely a list of insults. It was a revelation of the shadow of the gods. Loki was forcing them to look at their own hypocrisies, their own betrayals, and the blood that stained their own hands. He was the mirror in which they saw their own decay. When the goddess Skadi threatened him with the venom of the serpent, Loki did not flinch. He reminded her that it was his hand that led the gods to kill her father, Thjazi. Finally, the earth shook, and the heavy, rhythmic thud of Mjolnir announced the arrival of Thor. The thunder god, who had been away hunting giants, did not engage in the verbal games. He threatened to silence the trickster with the finality of his hammer. Loki, knowing that his work here was done, spoke his final insults to Thor and vanished from the hall, leaving the gods in a state of fractured, bitter ruin. He had broken the social contract of Asgard forever. Loki fled to the highest, most desolate mountains of Midgard, near the roaring waterfall of Franangr. There, he built a house with 4 doors, one facing each cardinal direction, so that he could watch for the gods from every side. During the long, lonely hours of his exile, he sat by his fire and invented the very thing that would lead to his capture, the fishing net. He wove the threads together, his mind calculating the movements of those who swim beneath the surface, not realizing that he was weaving the pattern of his own doom. When he saw the Aesir approaching, led by the wisdom of Odin, Loki threw the net into the fire and transformed himself into a salmon, leaping into the cold, churning waters of the waterfall. He believed he could hide in the shadows of the rocks, but the gods found the charred remains of the net in the hearth. They reconstructed the pattern and used Loki's own invention to sweep the river. After several attempts, Thor himself waded into the water and caught the salmon by the tail, his iron grip crushing the trickster's spirit. The gods took Loki to a dark, damp cave, a place where the sun never reached, and the walls wept with a perpetual freezing moisture. This was not a place of justice, but of a vengeance so profound it bordered on the monstrous. They brought Loki's 2 sons by his wife Sigyn, Narfi and Vali. In a display of horrific irony, they transformed Vali into a wolf, and the boy, possessed by a sudden predatory madness, tore his brother Narfi apart. The gods then took the warm, bloody entrails of Narfi and used them to bind Loki to 3 jagged rocks, one under his shoulders, one under his loins, and one under his knees. Through the application of ancient, dark magic, the entrails turned into chains of cold, unbreakable iron. But their cruelty did not end there. Skadi, still nursing the memory of her father's death and the insults in Aegir's hall, took a venomous serpent and fastened it above Loki's head. The snake's mouth was open, its fangs dripping with a caustic, burning venom that fell directly onto Loki's face. The pain was beyond the endurance of any living thing. Every drop was like molten lead searing through his skin and into his bones. Yet, in this deepest darkness, a flicker of loyalty remained. Sigyn, the faithful wife who had been ignored by the myths for centuries, did not abandon him. She took a wooden bowl and stood beside her bound husband, catching the venom before it could strike him. For eons, she stood in the silence of the cave, her arms aching and her heart breaking, the only witness to the trickster's agony. But whenever the bowl became full and Sigyn had to turn away to empty it, the venom would strike Loki's face. In those moments, he would writhe in such unbearable torment that his struggles would cause the entire earth to shake. These were the earthquakes of the north, the shudders of a bound god who had been stripped of his children, his brotherhood, and his dignity. Loki lay there in the lightless void, his mind a cauldron of bitterness. He was the knot at the end of the thread, the one who had been pushed into the shadow until he became the shadow itself. The blood of Narfi, the grief of Sigyn, and the venom of the serpent were the ingredients of a new world, a world where the old order would be burned away. He waited, his eyes fixed on the darkness, listening for the first sound of the frost that would signal the end. He was no longer the traveler or the friend. He was the prisoner of the Aesir, and his only remaining purpose was to survive until the day he could break his chains and watch the halls of Asgard fall into the sea. The time of the gods did not end with a sudden explosion, but with a slow, agonizing descent into a winter that had no heart. This was the Fimbul winter, the great winter, where 3 summers vanished without a trace, replaced by a relentless, biting frost that turned the very blood of men into ice. The sun and the moon, chased for eons by the wolves Ul and Hati, were finally consumed, leaving the 9 realms in a state of absolute, terrifying darkness. The stars fell from the sky like dying embers, and the boundaries between the worlds began to dissolve. In the deepest reaches of the cave where Loki lay bound, the tremors of the earth became a continuous, roaring upheaval. The entrails of his son, which had held him fast for centuries, finally snapped. The chains of iron shattered. Loki, the prince of lies, the father of monsters, was free. He stood in the darkness, his face scarred by the venom and his heart a cold stone of vengeance, and he looked toward the horizon where the world was ending. Loki did not go to Asgard to beg for peace. He went to the north, to the land of the dead and the realm of the giants, to gather his children. From the depths of the ocean, Jormungandr, the Midgard serpent, rose with a force that caused the seas to boil and flood the lands. The serpent's breath poisoned the air, turning the sky into a thick, toxic fog of green and gray. From the shadows of the iron wood, Fenrir the wolf broke his silken tether, Gleipnir. His jaws were so vast that his lower jaw touched the earth, and his upper jaw reached the heavens, and his eyes burned with the fire of 1,000 suns. From the kingdom of hell, the dead emerged, the pale, silent armies of those who had died without honor, led by the goddess of the half-gray face. They boarded a ship named Naglfar, a vessel built from the fingernails and toenails of dead men, a ship of forgotten remains that cut through the frozen waves with a sound like the grinding of teeth. Loki took the helm of this ghost ship, his hand steady as he steered the armies of chaos toward the final battlefield. The gods of Asgard, alerted by the haunting blast of Heimdall's Gjallarhorn, prepared for their final stand. They knew that their fate was sealed, but they would meet it with the dignity of warriors. They rode across the Bifrost Bridge one last time, the rainbow shimmering and cracking under the weight of their iron-shod horses. The battlefield was the plain of Vigridr, a vast expanse that stretched for 100 leagues in every direction. On one side stood the Aesir and the Einherjar, the glorious dead of Valhalla. On the other stood the giants, the monsters, and the children of Loki. The air was filled with the roar of the wolf, the hiss of the serpent, and the rhythmic, terrifying beat of Surt's flaming sword. The battles that followed were the climax of the Norse cosmic drama. Odin faced the wolf Fenrir, the beast he had tried to bind with a silken thread. The All-Father fought with the spear Gungnir, but the wolf's hunger was absolute. Fenrir swallowed the king of the gods whole, ending the reign of the High One in a single, visceral moment. Thor faced his ancient rival, Jormungandr. He struck the serpent with Mjolnir, crushing its skull and ending the threat to Midgard. But as he took 9 steps away from the fallen monster, the venom of the serpent overtook him. The god of thunder fell to the earth, his hammer slipping from his hand as he breathed his last. Freyr fell to Surt, the fire giant, his lack of a sword proving his undoing. The world was a slaughterhouse of divine blood and ancient grudges. Amidst this chaos, Loki sought out his own final destiny. He did not seek Odin or Thor. He sought the one who had always seen him for what he was, Heimdall, the white god. They met on the blood-stained grass of Vigridr, 2 figures who represented the ultimate opposites, the guardian of order and the bringer of chaos. Their duel was silent and relentless, a dance of blades that reflected the dying light of the world. Heimdall's sword, Hufud, struck through the trickster's heart, but as the guardian delivered the fatal blow, Loki's own blade found its mark. they fell together, two enemies who had watched each other for eons, their blood mingling on the earth just as the blood of Odin and Loki had once mingled in the beginning. Loki died as he had lived, in the middle of a struggle he had started, taking down the very structure he had helped to build. As the gods and the monsters fell, Surt, the giant of Muspelheim, raised his sword of fire and cast it across the 9 realms. The world tree, Yggdrasil, began to burn. The flames consumed the halls of Asgard, the forests of Midgard, and the mists of Niflheim. The earth sank into the sea, and the universe returned to the silence and the darkness of Ginnungagap. The fire was the final cleansing, the absolute end of the cycle. Loki's fire, the spark that had started with a cruel striker hitting a leaf, had finally consumed the entire forest of existence. But the myth does not end in the ash. In the silence that followed the fire, a new earth began to rise from the waves, green and vibrant, washed clean of the old sorrows. The sons of Thor, Modi and Magni, survived, carrying their father's hammer into a new age. Baldur and Hödur returned from the kingdom of Hel, their brother's quarrel forgotten in the light of a new sun. 2 humans, Leaf and Leaf-Thrusser, emerged from the heart of the world tree, where they had hidden from the flames, ready to begin the story of man once again. The world was reborn, but it was a world without the shadow of Loki, and yet it was a world that had been made possible by his destruction. Loki's legacy is the very fabric of the stories we tell. He was the one who reminded us that even the gods must change, that order without chaos is stagnant, and that every beginning carries the seed of its own end. He was the catalyst, the thorn, the mother, and the murderer. In the calm of the new world, the memories of his tricks and his tragedies remain as whispers in the wind. He is the reminder that we must cherish the light, precisely because the shadow is always waiting at the edge of the fire. As we close this chapter of the ancient legends, let us reflect on the trickster's journey, from the spark in the iron wood to the fire that consumed the world. May your sleep be peaceful, protected from the venom of the snake and the hunger of the wolf, and may you find in the stories of old the wisdom to navigate the changing winds of your own destiny. If you found peace and curiosity in this deep dive into the shadows of the North, consider subscribing to the Hearths of Myths and liking this journey. There are many more legends waiting in the embers of our hearth, and I would be honored to share them with you as we drift into the quiet reaches of the night. Until we meet again under the branches of the world tree, stay curious, stay calm, and let the myths guide your dreams.